She was a young white woman with her whole future planned, and he was a 53-year-old black man who had already seen a lifetime of struggles. Nobody expected their worlds to collide, yet when it did, the one thing more shocking than their love was the hatred it unleashed. Whispers spread through the town, stares turned into insults, and soon even family became enemies. But when the world tried to tear them apart, their secret only grew stronger. Still, every stolen glance came with a price. Every step together carried the weight of judgment. And then, the unthinkable happened, a moment so heartbreaking it would test not only their love, but their very will to survive. Would their bond endure the storm, or would prejudice destroy everything they held dear? She was 24, bright-eyed, and full of dreams. Her name was Emily, a young white woman, raised in a small town where traditions lingered heavier than the summer heat. To anyone who looked at her, she seemed like the perfect daughter, ambitious, polite, and raised under the quiet but watchful eyes of her conservative family. Her parents expected her life to follow a path they could predict, finishing school, finding a respectable man, and building a family that would reflect their carefully preserved reputation. Emily's world had always felt secure but also confining, as though her every step was predetermined. Miles away, in the very same town, lived James. He was a 53-year-old black man whose life had been shaped by both hardship and resilience. Decades of quiet perseverance had etched lines of wisdom into his face. James had worked most of his life in labor-intensive jobs, often overlooked, often dismissed, but never broken. He carried himself with dignity, always extending kindness to others, despite the weight of prejudice that never seemed to fully leave him. To the younger generation, he was almost invisible, a man who had lived too long on the fringes of a society that only saw his color before his humanity. Emily and James lived in different worlds, yet in the same town. Their lives ran parallel, occasionally brushing against one another in brief moments. Emily would sometimes notice James at the local library, sitting quietly with books about history and philosophy, a man who sought knowledge even when the world tried to deny it to him. James, on the other hand, had noticed Emily's warmth long before she ever knew his name. There was something about her curiosity, the way she carried herself, that reminded him of a time when hope was more abundant. Life for both of them seemed ordinary on the surface. Emily filled her days with study, her part-time job at a cafe, and evenings with her family. James spent his time working, helping neighbors when he could, and sitting on his porch during quiet nights, reflecting on years that had been filled with both joy and pain. Neither of them could have imagined how their paths were about to converge. What began as a simple kindness was the spark. Emily, seeing James struggling with heavy bags one afternoon, offered to help. That moment, brief and unremarkable to anyone passing by, planted the first seed of connection. For her, it was instinct, helping someone who appeared to need it. For him, it was surprising, not the action itself, but the rare absence of judgment in her eyes. It was as if she looked directly at him, not through him, and for a man who had spent so much of his life invisible, that glance carried weight. Their interactions grew in subtle ways. Emily would greet him at the cafe when he came by, sliding his coffee across the counter with a smile that felt genuine. James, cautious but grateful, began to return those small gestures, offering wisdom in simple sentences, the kind that only comes from years of weathering storms. Slowly, without either of them naming it, an unspoken bond began to form. The town, however, noticed things others might have missed. Whispers started in hushed tones, a young white woman seen lingering in conversations with a much older black man. In a place where invisible lines had long been drawn, such crossings were not just frowned upon but condemned. Emily was naive enough at first to believe that kindness would be understood for what it was. James, on the other hand, felt the weight of those stares before she ever recognized them. He had lived through enough to know how quickly suspicion could turn into hostility. Beneath the surface of their growing friendship, the air began to thicken with unspoken tension. Emily's parents, though unaware of the extent of her encounters, occasionally commented about the kind of people she should avoid. James's neighbors gave him wary looks, some shaking their heads, others muttering under their breath. Yet, in those quiet moments they shared, none of it mattered. There was a purity to their connection, an authenticity that neither of them had experienced in a long time. Emily admired James's wisdom, the way he spoke about life without bitterness, despite all he had endured. James admired Emily's courage, even if she didn't yet realize she was being brave. To him, she embodied the hope that perhaps the next generation could see beyond the boundaries the world had created. To her, he represented a truth she had always yearned for, the kind of connection that goes beyond appearances, beyond age, beyond color. But reality was never far behind. The more time they spent together, the heavier the shadows grew. Emily began to notice the lingering glances when she walked beside him in public, the way conversations hushed when she entered the room. James, though used to such treatment, felt a new kind of fear, not for himself, but for her. He knew what communities like theirs could do when they felt their unspoken rules were being broken. He had seen it before. Still, neither of them turned away. Each shared moment made walking away impossible, and though no words of love had yet been spoken, it was clear that something deeper was beginning to grow. A spark was turning into flame, and with it, the inevitability of conflict. The town was waiting. Families were watching. And beneath the fragile beauty of what Emily and James were building, prejudice was stirring, preparing to strike. The first cracks in Emily and James's world appeared quietly, almost unnoticeably. What had once felt like harmless whispers in the background began to grow sharper, carrying the sting of judgment with every passing glance. At the cafe where Emily worked, her co-workers began exchanging uneasy looks whenever James stopped by. The smiles they once gave her turned tight, and the conversations hushed when he entered the room. At first, Emily brushed it off, telling herself it was nothing more than idle curiosity. But James knew better. He had lived long enough to recognize the beginnings of exclusion, and he felt it pressing in on them like a shadow. The days that followed brought a new unease. Emily's parents, who had always trusted her, started asking more pointed questions about where she spent her time. Her mother hinted that people in town were beginning to talk, suggesting that Emily should be more mindful of how she appeared in public. It wasn't said outright, but the message was clear. Her father, more direct, reminded her that certain choices could ruin a family's name. Though they never mentioned James by name, Emily felt the weight of their disapproval tightening, like a noose. The first real test came one evening when Emily and James were seen walking together down Main Street. It was innocent, nothing more than a shared stroll after a long day, but to the town it became a scandal. Eyes followed them from porches and storefronts. Whispers turned to sneers, and one man spat on the ground as they passed. Emily's heart raced, not from fear of James, but from the sudden realization that their bond had become a public spectacle. James, though steady on the outside, felt a deep ache within. He had spent years shielding himself from such moments, but now he worried for her, for what this would cost her in a world that was far less forgiving than she believed. The harassment grew bolder. At the cafe, a group of regulars who had once been friendly suddenly refused to sit at Emily's tables. One woman made a loud comment about young girls throwing their lives away, loud enough for Emily to hear, her words like poison disguised as pity. James, too, faced his share of hostility. His neighbors, who had once accepted his quiet helpfulness, now eyed him with suspicion. Some stopped speaking to him altogether, while others muttered curses when they thought he couldn't hear. The walls of the town seemed to be closing in, brick by brick, with every glance, every word, every silence. Still, Emily and James refused to let go. Their bond only deepened, forged in the fire of adversity. They found refuge in quiet moments, away from judging eyes. In the stillness of James's porch at night, in the warmth of Emily's laughter when the world felt too heavy. But even in those stolen moments, they knew the world outside was waiting, ready to strike. The breaking point came at a local church event, one that Emily had attended every year with her family. This time, James went with her, hoping to share in something meaningful, something normal. But the moment they walked in together, the room fell silent. Conversations died, eyes turned, and the weight of disapproval hung in the air like smoke. The pastor's sermon that day, though not naming them directly, was a thinly veiled rebuke, a warning about straying from God's intended order. Emily sat rigid in her pew, her cheeks burning, while James kept his gaze forward, absorbing every word like a blade across his skin. When they left, people avoided their eyes, but the judgment lingered. It was not just whispers anymore. It was condemnation dressed as righteousness. The days after the church service were the hardest. Emily's parents confronted her directly, her father's voice trembling with rage as he demanded she end whatever nonsense was happening with James. Her mother wept, torn between fear of gossip and the hope that her daughter might still come to her senses. Emily tried to explain, to tell them that what she felt was real, that James was more than the color of his skin or the years between them. But her words only seemed to deepen the divide. She left the house that night feeling more alone than she ever had, but with a resolve that nothing her parents said could take away. James, meanwhile, bore the brunt of the town's cruelty. One afternoon, as he walked through the grocery store, a group of men cornered him in the aisle. They didn't lay a hand on him, but their words were sharp, cutting deep. They accused him of corrupting Emily, of taking advantage of her youth. The encounter left him shaken, not because of their threats. He had faced worse in his life, but because of the venom in their voices, the clear intention to break him down. He left the store that day with his head high, but his heart heavy. He wondered how much longer Emily could endure this storm, how much longer before the weight crushed them both. The harassment escalated further when Emily lost her job at the cafe. Officially, her boss cited staff cutbacks, but Emily knew the truth. Her presence had become a problem, a distraction, a scandal that the cafe no longer wanted to be associated with. Losing the job was more than just losing income. It was a public declaration that she had crossed a line, and now she would pay the price. James blamed himself, carrying the guilt of her losses like a burden he could not set down. Emily, however, stood firm, reminding him that love was never something to regret. Yet the cost continued to rise. Friends who once called her stopped answering, invitations to gatherings vanished, and the town that had once been her home now felt like hostile ground. Emily and James found themselves isolated, united only in each other. And while their love grew stronger, so did the forces determined to tear them apart. The final blow in this rising storm came one evening when they decided, despite the risks, to have dinner together at a small restaurant on the edge of town. For a while, things felt normal. They laughed, shared stories, and tried to forget the world outside. But it didn't last. A group of men at a nearby table began making crude remarks, their voices loud enough to draw attention. Other diners turned to stare, some with curiosity, others with disgust. The tension thickened until one of the men stood, walked to their table, and spat a slur so venomous it silenced the room. Emily's hands shook, but James reached for hers, steadying her with his calm. They left before things escalated further, but the humiliation lingered long after they stepped outside. That night, Emily wept, not from shame but from fury. She had always believed the world was kinder, more just, but now she saw it for what it was, cruel, narrow, unyielding. James held her, his heart breaking for the pain she carried, knowing too well that this was a reality he had endured for decades. But for Emily, it was a new wound, fresh and raw. The storm was far from over. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into conflict, every choice pushing them closer to a breaking point. The world around them had drawn its battle lines, and the question was no longer if they would face a reckoning, but when. And as they clung to each other in the growing darkness, neither could see the confrontation that lay just ahead, a moment that would test not only their love, but the very core of who they were. The night of the town's annual festival was meant to be a celebration, lights strung across the square, music echoing through the streets, and families gathering as they had for generations. For Emily, it had always been a place of comfort, a reminder of childhood laughter and community warmth. But this year was different. This year, she walked into the festival with James by her side, her hand firmly clasped in his. The moment they stepped into the crowd, the air shifted. Conversations dulled, laughter faltered, and all eyes turned their way. The square, once alive with joy, felt suffocating under the weight of judgment. At first, Emily held her head high, determined to show that nothing, no whisper, no glare, could diminish the truth of what they shared. James, though steady, felt the old ache of history clawing at his chest, a reminder of every door slammed in his face. Every word meant to reduce him to nothing. He wanted to protect Emily from it, to shield her from the cruelty he knew was coming. But she refused to let go of his hand, her fingers laced tightly with his, defiant in the face of their stares. It began quietly, a voice from the crowd muttering, something sharp and ugly. Then another, louder. Soon the whispers swelled into a wave of hostility. Someone laughed cruelly, and another shouted, "Go back where you belong." The words struck like stones, their venom burning deeper than any physical wound. Emily's heart pounded, her cheeks flushed with rage, but she refused to falter. James's jaw tightened, his silence a shield against the storm, but his hand trembled slightly in hers, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of history repeating itself. Then it happened. A man, red-faced and intoxicated, stumbled forward from the crowd. His voice carried over the square, sharp and taunting, as he hurled words too vile to repeat. When James tried to guide Emily away, the man stepped closer, blocking their path. In one swift, hateful gesture, he shoved James hard, sending him staggering back. The crowd gasped, but no one moved to intervene. Emily rushed to James's side, her eyes blazing with fury, her voice trembling as she demanded they stop. But her words were drowned in the rising noise of the crowd, some jeering, others whispering, all watching. It was then that Emily's father emerged, his face pale with rage. He had been watching from a distance, hoping against hope that his daughter might turn away, that she might finally listen to reason. Instead, he now saw her standing in defiance beside James, her arm wrapped around him, protecting him as though he were family. His voice cut through the noise, trembling with both anger and desperation. "Emily, enough. This ends now. You will not shame this family any longer." The square fell silent. All eyes turned to Emily, waiting to see whether she would obey or rebel. Her father's words carried the full weight of the community's judgment, their shared belief that what she had chosen was unacceptable. Her mother stood a few steps behind, her face streaked with tears, silently begging her daughter to walk away. For Emily, the moment felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, the world holding its breath, waiting to see whether she would fall or fly. James, battered but unbroken, whispered for her to go. His voice was soft, pained, filled with love, but heavy with resignation. He didn't want her to lose everything, her family, her home, the life she had built. He was ready to step aside if it meant she could be spared. But Emily, her eyes blazing through tears, shook her head. For the first time, She found her voice stronger than the fear that had silenced her for weeks. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the air. "I will not walk away. Not from him. Not from us." The words rang across the square, louder than the jeers, louder than her father's fury, louder than the shame that had been forced upon them. It was a declaration, raw and unyielding, that shattered the silence. The crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs rippling like a restless tide. Some turned away in disgust, unwilling to witness her rebellion. Others, silently, felt the crack of truth in her defiance, though few dared to admit it aloud. Her father's face hardened, his voice breaking as he declared her no longer his daughter. The words struck like a final blow, severing the ties of family in front of everyone. Emily's knees buckled under the weight of it, but James caught her, steadying her once more. In that moment, surrounded by hatred, rejection, and humiliation, they stood together, unbroken. The festival lights flickered above them, casting their shadows long and defiant across the square. But as the couple turned to leave, the man who had shoved James earlier lunged again, his anger unchecked. Gasps filled the air as his fist swung, aiming not for James, but for Emily. Time seemed to slow, the crowd frozen between action and apathy. James stepped forward, his body shielding hers, his strength rising from a lifetime of battles fought in silence. The blow landed against him instead, and he staggered, but did not fall. Emily screamed, her voice echoing through the square like a siren. For the first time, someone in the crowd moved. A woman, older, weary but bold, stepped forward to confront the attacker. Her voice, though trembling, carried authority as she demanded the violent stop. Her action broke the crowd's paralysis, and slowly, reluctantly, others stepped in, pulling the man away. The damage, however, was already done. The image of James shielding Emily with his own body, of Emily standing defiantly against her father, was seared into the minds of everyone present. The festival continued, but for Emily and James, the night had become the battlefield on which their love was tested. They left hand in hand, bruised and broken, but unyielding. Every step away from the square was a step into an uncertain future, one where they no longer belonged to the safety of family or community, and yet, in their hearts, they knew they had crossed a threshold. The worst had been revealed, the deepest, wounds laid bare. What remained was the question that hung heavy in the night air, unanswered but urgent. After losing everything to stand for love, could they ever find a place where that love would be enough? When Emily and James walked away from the festival that night, it felt as though the ground had been pulled out from beneath their feet. Behind them, the crowd slowly returned to its music, its laughter, its fragile normalcy. But for the two of them, nothing would ever be the same. Emily had lost her father's acceptance, her mother's warmth, and the sense of belonging she had always carried in that small town. James carried the sting of humiliation, the pain of another wound in a life already marred by prejudice. And, yet, as they held hands in the quiet of the night, their steps uneven but steady, there was a strange sense of clarity between them. They had faced the fire, and though it had burned, it had not consumed them. The days that followed were heavy. Emily's family cut all ties, her father's words echoing like a final verdict. She was no longer his daughter. Her phone calls went unanswered, her letters returned unopened. The rejection gnawed at her, leaving her restless at night, her tears soaking into the pillow. James, too, bore scars, not only the bruises from the attack, but the heavier weight of guilt. He feared she had sacrificed too much for him, that she would one day look back and resent him for what she had lost. Their love, once sweet and simple, had become a battlefield where every embrace carried both comfort and ache. Yet, in the midst of their pain, a quiet strength began to take root. They moved to a neighboring town where the air was less suffocating, where people were not so bound by old grudges. It wasn't perfect. Whispers followed them in grocery aisles, stares lingered too long in restaurants, and doors still closed without explanation. But there were also moments of kindness. A neighbor who brought them fresh bread without judgment. A co-worker who defended James when others tried to undermine him. A teacher at the school where Emily volunteered who told her in a hushed voice that she admired her courage. These small sparks of humanity lit their path through the darkness. Over time, their relationship became not just about love, but about resilience. They learned to draw strength from each other, to become each other's anchor when the world tried to tear them apart. Emily discovered a fierceness in herself she had never known, a refusal to bow to hate, a determination to live without apology. James found healing in her unwavering loyalty, a reminder that he was not defined by the prejudice of others, but by the love that endured in spite of it. Together, they began to rebuild a life, brick by brick, choosing hope even when despair loomed. Years passed, and with them came change. Society, slowly, uneasily, began to shift. The voices once drowned out by hate grew louder, demanding justice, demanding equality. Emily and James, once the subject of ridicule, became symbols in their own quiet way. Their story spread, first whispered among neighbors, then shared through friends, and eventually reaching ears far beyond their town. Some condemned them still, refusing to let go of their prejudice. But others found courage in their defiance, inspiration in their love. Emily's mother, after years of silence, reached out one autumn evening. Her voice trembled as she confessed the regret that had weighed on her heart. She had allowed fear of judgment to sever the bond with her daughter, and the absence had hollowed her life. Though Emily's father remained unyielding, her mother's steps toward reconciliation brought a measure of healing. They met in secret at first, quiet conversations, over coffee where tears flowed freely, where love and regret tangled together. Slowly, a fragile thread of family was rewoven, not whole, but not entirely lost. For James, the years brought both trials and triumphs. He faced setbacks in his work, doors closed because of the color of his skin, but he also found allies who refused to let him be diminished. His strength, his integrity, and his perseverance could not be ignored forever. Eventually, he earned respect, not from all, but from enough to carve a place where he belonged. And with Emily by his side, every victory, no matter how small, felt monumental. Their love endured storms that might have destroyed others. They argued, they wept, they questioned if the fight was worth it. But always, they returned to each other, to the simple truth that love was the one thing the world could not take from them unless they surrendered it. That truth carried them through the darkest days. By the time decades had passed, their hair silvered and their hands weathered with age, Emily and James often found themselves looking back on that night at the festival. What once had been a source of pain became a marker of their strength. It was the night the world tried to break them and failed. It was the night they chose love over fear, defiance over submission. And though it had cost them dearly, it had also shaped the life they built together, one rooted in resilience and courage. Their story became a lesson for others, a reminder etched into the hearts of those who heard it, that prejudice may wound, but it cannot conquer love that refuses to yield. Parents told their children of Emily and James not as cautionary tales, but as proof that love was worth the fight. Friends whispered their names with admiration, and strangers found hope in the echoes of their defiance. And when Emily and James finally sat together on the porch of their home, the sun setting behind them in a blaze of orange and gold, they felt the quiet satisfaction of a life lived fully. They had not erased the scars of racism, nor had they healed all wounds, but they had shown in their own way that hate could not define them. Their love, tested in fire, had emerged unbroken. The lesson was clear, as timeless as it was urgent. Hate divides, but love unites. Prejudice destroys families, but unity rebuilds them. Racism chains the human spirit, but love sets it free. And so their story ends not in despair, but in hope. A hope that whispers to all who listen. If love can survive the fire, then perhaps one day the world can too.